Our modern concepts and our modern ideas about women, the way that we view women, is shaped out of a place of misogyny. It's shaped from religion, and it's also shaped from slavery. One of the things that I see with many of these content creators, these podcasters, these YouTubers who deem themselves as being relationship coaches, and they're trying to talk about etiquette when it comes to women, how women should be conservative. And whenever they talk about characteristics that are distasteful in women, when they speak about characteristics in women that you should disdain and make sure this is not part of your character, they always point to black women as the default. You also see a lot of black male content creators that constantly use their platforms, such as somebody like a Tommy Sotomayor. They use their platform to echo or perpetuate a lot of the ideas and concepts that we learn about black women, but learn about black people nonetheless through slavery, through the transatlantic slave trade, then the domestic slave trade which happened in this country after 1808. A lot of these views are not views that we independently have came to a conclusion that this is empirical truth when you're speaking about black women. A lot of these are coming from not the indigenous cultures that you would have found throughout West Africa, not the indigenous cultures that you would have found in Mesoamerica, but they're coming from cultures that were introduced in these places, whether you're talking about France, the British Isles, whether you're talking about the Portuguese or the Spaniards. These are ideals that are coming out of Western Europe that were imposed on these places, and these are ideals that we have about love, about relationships, even until the slave community by the scholar John Blassingame. I also encourage you to read Inhumane Bondage by Brian Davis. One of the most compelling things about these works is that you truly get a gauge, you truly get a perspective of how black women were viewed during the antebellum period. You're not looking at a period where people were viewed as human beings, more specifically black women. You're looking at a period where these people are viewed as property. They're viewed as nothing more than a beast of burden, and more so than that, constantly being the victims of rape, sexual assault, consistently throughout their lifetimes. There were times where slave owners could come in and they could actually sexually assault a man's wife and he could do nothing about it. There were times where, and even up into the civil rights era, in many southern states and northern states even black women, black children could be victims of sexual assault, but nobody could call the police. Nobody could actually go to law enforcement in fear of being persecuted themselves. So when we look at a lot of these ideals about, for example, the hypersexuality that you would find amongst black women, and once again, I've seen these shows like Fresh and Fit, I've seen these shows like Just Pearly Things, and they're talking about the body count, the infamous body count. The one thing that's indicative of a horrible person is if they have a high body count. You see these subjects discussed in a quotidian manner on these different platforms. You see the fact that it's implied. They may not state it explicitly or overtly, but it's implied that when you look at black women, you're seeing people that suffer from or that are into promiscuous activity. They just have this kind of innate habit to be subject to their sexual urges. This is a concept that you could go back, you could read it in the writings of Thomas Jefferson. There's a book called Slave Testimonies by John Blassingame as well. The scholar that I mentioned, in this book, you see how these women were treated, and a lot of these talking points that disguise themselves as solutions, as resolutions, as ideas we need to hear, as critiques that we need, as a standard or a paradigm that we need to follow. A lot of these things, these ideas that are perpetuated on these platforms, they are coming from a place of racism. They are coming from a place of slavery. So you have to ask yourself, why is it okay on these platforms to monetize hatred, to monetize disdain against black women? Malcolm X is quoted as saying that black women are one of the most unprotected, neglected groups of people in this country. I would argue, if you look at the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, or at least when the British got into it, because the British were 100 years behind the Portuguese and the Spaniards. As you know, the Pope issued the Treaty of Tordesillas that, gave the Spaniards access to this side of the Atlantic and the Portuguese access to this side of the Atlantic or the Caribbean, etc. But you see the British, they actually come 100 years after that. But nonetheless, when you go and you look at the transatlantic slave trade, there are writings and depictions, for example, of black women actually being used to subdue mutiny through terror. So what they would do, they would take a black woman that was pregnant with child. It was nothing to cut the fetus out of the woman, stump on it, step on it, and then tortured the body of the mother in front of the other people on this vessel of horror, of dysentery, of just levels of unsanitary conditions that we can't even fathom. But they would be used in a way to actually instill fear and to instill compliance. There's a really cool story. I was looking at a lecture with Marcus Rediker. He wrote the book called The Slave Ship. He also wrote another book about the Amistad Rebellion, which is another great book as well. But one of the things that Marcus Rediker was talking about in his book, when he was speaking about it, ways that he would actually get slaves to acquiesce and comply. He mentioned an event that was so terrifying and insanely brutal, it just blew my mind. And it was on a vessel, and there was a belief amongst certain groups, like for example, I believe like some Igbo, there was a belief that if you jumped over the ship and you get into the water, that you may be transported back to your homeland spiritually. There was a belief in that. And then other people just, they jumped over because of fear. They were terrified. They've never been in water before. You have to remember that when you're looking at the transatlantic slave trade, I know I'm about to digress, but when you look at it, you're talking about people that were brought from deep in the interior that may not have never seen the ocean at any point in their lives. But nonetheless, he said as a way to kind of discourage this, they took a woman and they put her on a rope and they put her out in the ocean. This is one of the ways to discourage people. Mind you, black women were used as a way to instill fear and to discourage people from jumping overboard. They took this woman and they put her on a rope and they dumped her down in the water. Now she started to scream and flail her arms, and people on board the vessel, they thought she was doing it because she couldn't swim and she was drowning. But what they saw left them in horror. When the ship captain ordered her to be raised, part of her body had been mangled by a shark. This caused many people to stay compliant, to be fearful of jumping overboard. This is something that was a common occurrence on slave ships to get people to acquiesce to the conditions and to the orders of the crew and the captain and things like that were going on the ship. We see this on The Slave Ship, which is a book by Marcus Rediker. We also see the fact that many women and children were subject to sexual assault and pedophilia. And this is something, this might be uncomfortable to talk about, but a lot of times when you're watching, slave movies, whether it's Ruse, whether it's Sankofa or Sankofa, and you see these women being taken advantage of sexually, well, what they don't talk about is that with many of these black women, they were assaulted as children. It was nothing for black women as young as 8 and 9 to be abused by a slave owner. So this is something that commonly happened. And so one of the arguments that they would use to justify this, one of the ways they would justify sexually assaulting children, because this is what they were doing, they would say that these black women had an insatiable sexual appetite, that they could not contain themselves around these slave owners, people on the ships, and so they were throwing themselves at these men. This was an argument that was used to justify pedophilia, don't know if I can say that, on YouTube against black women. So the reason why that particular argument is relevant is because we hear it now when a woman is sexually assaulted, that what was she doing? What was she wearing that caused that to happen? Or, hey, if something happens, if a woman gets pregnant, if a woman gets, sexually assaulted, hey, they're just like that. And once again, in many of these arguments, black women become the default when you're talking about that, when you're speaking about that. But think about it like this. If you're in different societies throughout West Africa, whether you're talking about the Ashanti, whether you're talking about the Serer, which is in Senegal, whether you're talking about the Mende, which you would find in modern day Liberia, or even in Mesoamerican cultures. We know about the Arawa, we know about the Dainos, we know about the people of the Mexica or the Mexicado or the Triple Alliance. And they had a different way of looking at nudity and body exposure and body art. Think about it like this. Who's more sophisticated? A culture where a woman can walk around naked and not get accosted or raped, or a culture where if a woman shows her thigh, then that's justification for her being sexually assaulted? all of the crime, all of the hate, all of the issues that we have in our community, all of our shortcomings, let's blame it on black women. I consider this the Eve complex. So this analogy goes back to the book of Genesis, where we see the story of Adam and Eve. And Eve is tempted by the serpent and she bites the apple. And her biting of the apple is the catalyst for the fall of mankind and our fall from greatness and being expelled out of the Garden of Eden. There seems to be this idea that all of the problems that we face as a community are attributed to black women, whether it's broken homes, single parenthood, all of these things solely rests on the shoulders of black women. The reality is that when you're looking at the black community in its totality, so whether you're looking at the wealth gap, whether you're looking at housing, whether you're looking at education, whether you're looking at crime, there's a myriad of factors that come into play. Both us as black men and black women have a hand in it. There's also systemic issues that have gone on as well. You know, whether you're looking at the two Homestead Acts, the second Homestead Act that happened where over 46 million acres of land were opened up to black people throughout the South. But, you know, FDA agents have cost many black farmers, and over the next 50 years, over $90 billion in farmland, which could have made African Americans a powerful political class in this country, was lost. Whether you're talking about white flight, redlining, where you're talking about, you know, wealthy black neighborhoods being destroyed or having highways brought through them, whatever you're talking about, whether you're talking about the crack epidemic, etc. There's so many different things that happen to cause the current state of the black community, and it's really disingenuous, it's really ignorant of the history for us to rest all of those problems on the shoulders of black women. But many times we do it. I've seen videos with Kevin Samuels, and yeah, he has some things that I did agree with. There were things that he said that I did not agree with. I don't agree with anyone wholeheartedly. I always have my objections, I always have my critiques, but one of the things that I noticed is that he would always kind of use this terminology. He would always say that women should be thankful for the world that men built. He would always say that, you know, in this world, when you look around, you have to be thankful for the world that men built for you. And my problem with that particular argument is that it's almost analogous to saying, when I've heard racists say that black people should be thankful for being brought out of Africa, for, you know, being exposed to mathematics. Meanwhile, the Moors, the Hindu numeral system that we use currently was brought into Europe via the Iberian Peninsula by the Moors. But nonetheless, that I don't look at in terms of race. I don't look in terms of a phenotype or pigmentation makes you more superior or inferior to the other. You know, race is a silly concept that really has to be questioned and destroyed. But nonetheless, that argument is analogous to a racist saying that all modern invention is just attributed to white people, when you study the actual history, it's far more complicated than that. So many different groups, cultures, bodies, nations, cultures involved into getting to the point that we're now at as a world civilization. But nonetheless, this was the argument that I will always see him making. My other problem with a lot of the male podcasters, YouTubers, like I said, the Fresh and Fits, even your Kevin Samuels, anyone else out there, you know, Donovan Sharp, any of these different people, many of their critiques of women, it seems that the default bashing point is always black women. The default bashing point of the worst when it comes to promiscuity, the worst when it comes to marriage, the worst when it comes to single parent homes, the default is always black women. And once again, a lot of these arguments, a lot of these perspectives, they're rooted in slavery, and they're ignoring how black women have often been utilized in scientific experiments, how they've been used and exploited by different groups, ideologies, etc., to the point that we're at now. But these things aren't taken into consideration. The history of what happened to black women on plantations via medical experimentation, that's not taken into consideration. The sexual exploitation, none of that's taken into consideration when we're looking at the state of what happened to our community. And once again, we have this habit of looking at black women and black men as being diametrically opposed, and that's the wrong view to have. But once again, it's a very juvenile and racist concept, a racist anchor or racist root for a lot of these arguments that we make. But once again, you have to look at the things, and to me, I just have to wonder what the resolution is, because if you're just looking at black women as this monolith this thing that you can spit on, this thing that you can disrespect, this thing that you can use as the standard for everything wrong in women, without acknowledging the horrific plight that has occurred in this country. And like I said in other videos, I mean, everything politically to socially and even medically, Black women have. Again, it goes back to epigenetics. It's how trauma can be expressed genetically in progeny or offspring. Once again, I advise anybody to go and look at the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy when it comes to the post-traumatic slave syndrome, because it does a great job breaking down thoroughly the trauma that can be passed genetically from parent to offspring. And so when you look at the things that have happened in this country, you have to wonder how much trauma has been inherited, not only economically, not only mentally, not only spiritually, but on a genetic, visceral level as well. One of the things I've also spoken about is that you have people like J. Marion Sims. This is, something a lot of people have spoken about. I won't talk about it in too much detail, but J. Marion Sims is considered the father of modern gynecology. And the dark history of how that science got started is that he was able to practice on many enslaved women using a lot of crude instruments. Many women died because of how he experimented on them. Many women died from infection. Many women were unable to have children because of this. But you had these people that were able to be used in this capacity as guinea pigs would be for a medical experiment. And some people said, well, maybe the end justifies the means. But once again, you have this constant history of of Black women not having their self-agency, their humanity recognized, and seeing as nothing more than being used for work, being used for sex, or being used in a capacity for medical procedures that would not be allowed on any other group of people, just due to the risk, just due to how unsanitary it would have been, and just due to how overall dangerous it was as well. But once again, this is something that we often ignore. But beyond that, when you go to plantations, when you go and you look at the history of plantations, you can read books like Africanisms in American Culture. Once again, Inhumane Bondage by Brian Davis. There are a lot of different books where a lot of times we have this idea about slavery that you just had these people, they were just automatized. All they did was pick cotton. All they did was, labor. But what you have to remember is that when people were brought from Africa to the Americas, you're dealing with artisans, you're dealing with doctors, you're dealing with singers, you're dealing with dancers, you're dealing with farmers, you're dealing with people that were slaves to a degree in Africa that were slaves over here. You were dealing with people that caught slaves in Africa but got caught and got sold as a slave here in the Americas as well. So we're a product of a myriad of different Africans. But one of the things people don't understand is that a lot of recipes, medical patents, you had enslaved people that were working along with doctors to create stuff. You had enslaved people that were working along with mechanics to create certain inventions, certain innovations when it comes to vehicles, certain innovations when it comes to technology. But because they were enslaved and they weren't seen as humans, a lot of inventions that we currently benefit from was able to be stolen, basically copied and ripped off from these enslaved people because they really had no real way to fight it. But nonetheless, back to this tradition of turpitude and horrible things that has gone on against Black women, you have to recognize that this is something that's going. And then even racial hygiene. This is something that has been spoken about. But Hitler was influenced by the eugenics programs here in this country. Think about it like this. The eugenics programs here were so insane that it influenced a genocidal despot like Hitler to carry out programs like he was doing in Nazi Germany. We see the term eugenics was actually coined by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, and it comes from a Greek word that means well-born. And the whole concept and the idea behind eugenics is that certain traits were not considered worthy of being allowed in society, that you should actually sterilize certain people to weed out certain undesirable traits in society. One of the things that came out of eugenics is racial hygiene. And this is where, dark or Slavic people should not be allowed to reproduce. One of the tenets with racial hygiene was actually aimed at Black women. oddly enough, it said that black women should basically not be allowed to reproduce because black women were sexually indiscriminate. They were capricious. They were bound to just kind of like a lot of degenerate behavior, and that their progeny would carry on that same behavior. So this is a concept that comes straight out of eugenics. This is a concept that comes out of racial hygiene, and this is a concept of calling black women sexually indiscriminate and just having kids and capricious and all these different things. This is the same stuff that you see from your dating coaches, your red pill guys, your manosphere guys, your pearly things, all of these different content creators. Whenever they want to critique black women, it's done from a point of misogyny, it's done from a point of Western racism, and they perpetuate this unknowingly because they don't even question the way that they look at the world. They don't even question the paradigm of right and wrong and love and relationships that they just like automatons carry out without even really thinking about where they got that from. Just a brief study of history. Look at the slave laws of the Portuguese. If you look at the antebellum South, and you can go to any museum, you can go to any bookstore, you can go to any university library, and you can look and you can see slave laws. You can see how they describe the characteristic smells of enslaved people, how they looked at them, how they viewed them, how in certain cases, enslaved people were forced to sleep under porches naked. Just the heinous way that people viewed one group of human beings could view another group of human beings in this country. These are the things you get when you start to do research. And the funny thing is, it's not nothing funny at all. But what it is that if you look at the writings of some of like Portuguese, some of the Portuguese and the Spaniards and the French and the English who enslaved Africans, the way that they, once again, and I mention this because all of your favorite content creators, they are echoing talking points of racists. They are echoing talking points of enslavers. Your favorite content creators, red pill, dating people who want to bash black women and black men, they are echoing talking points of people who looked at other humans as people to do medical experiments on as people to sharpen knives on, as people to torture for fun, as people to sexually assault. Their standard of morale, their paradigm of right or wrong, we are still perpetuating it until this day, and we're not questioning it. And that's my problem with a lot of these dating guys, is that they're saying things that are inherently racist and anti-black, but they're not questioning it. It's just, and it's done because of ignorance. They don't do the research, they don't study. They do it out of a place of ignorance. And I can't be too mad at them. And even the beauty standard, a lot of times when we're looking at the beauty standard, it's done from a way where darker skinned women, even today, we're still colorless. We still have an issue with darker skinned women. We still have an issue with women that may not have the aquiline nose. We still have issues with women that may not have the thinner lips. And once again, beauty is diverse. There's no monolith. There's no monochromatic way to view beauty. Beauty is diverse. All groups, all ethnicities, all races have beauty within it. But the problem is when one particular point of beauty is kind of viewed as being superior to the way everyone else's phenotype may look. And we still see that currently. One of the things I was pointing out, I've noticed with a lot of men, when they're looking at women that come from the continent of Africa and they're looking at women from different African countries, they'll be so quick to talk about how beautiful Ethiopian women are in comparison to women that's coming from Namibia, or women that are coming from Ghana, women that are coming from Senegal. It's always Ethiopian women. And I think the reason why there's this emphasis on the beauty of Ethiopian women is due to the fact that they represent a phenotype that's closely aligned with what we consider beauty here in the West. So it allows you to date African women, but once again, it still correlates somewhat to our standard of beauty. But once again, all of these things, the beauty standards, the sexual limitations, the pathologizing of sexual behavior, all of these things have been learned through the lens and the scope and the paradigm of people that were racist and murderers and people that committed genocide and spread pathogens amongst different peoples. And once again, like I said, I don't make my content to be racist, to be anti-black, anti-white, anything. What I am saying is that you have to realize a lot of these perspectives, they come from a different period in this world's history, but we unknowingly or knowingly still perpetuate these same perspectives. YouTubers and podcasters are spewing a lot of rhetoric against black women, black men that has its origin in slavery and racism, has recently been validated by two content creators, one being Just Pearly Things and the other one Melanie King. Now, Melanie King, I have a little bit of respect for. I've watched some of her content, but nonetheless, Just Pearly Things, if you watch her channel, she recently had Nick Fuentes on, who is a self-proclaimed white supremacist. This is a guy that is a Holocaust denier. This is a person who speaks against reparations. This is a guy that says that slavery was somewhat embellished. This is a guy that often speaks out against interracial relationships, etc., etc., so on and so on and so on. And so she had him on the platform, and so he said how he felt like the Holocaust was embellished, that it wasn't as bad as it really was. Now, keep in mind, if you haven't seen her platform, and it caught my attention, it came across my radar, she primarily has used black male content creators to build her platform. Like I said, I don't watch too much of her shows, but this thing caught my eye. From what I see in the research I've done, she uses a lot of African people for her platform. From what I've seen, there's a lot of black, African-American, African people on her platform, more so than anyone else. Keep in mind, this is a person that turned around and had a white supremacist on their platform by the name of Nick Fuentes. And so they're talking about the Holocaust. She segues it into slavery. Her response is, oh gosh, it's kind of like the slavery stuff where, I mean, it was bad, but they make it more than what it seems for people to be controlled. Yeah. That does a lot to me when I hear that. Now, keep in mind, this is a content creator who has used black content creators to build a following of over 1.5 million followers. And she said this on her platform. Slavery was embellished. It wasn't as bad as they make it out to be, because they try to make it worse than what it really was, to control people. I don't have to get into a rant, but what I will say, when you're looking at slavery, you have to keep in mind that this was a time where if you wanted to be treated like a human, you could be mutilated, you could be starved to death, you could be beat to death. Your loved ones, your children, could be torn away from you at any moment. Your daughters could be victims of rape, and it's nothing that you can do about it. Your sons could be victims of rape as well, and there's nothing that you can do about it. People talk about house slave versus field slave. Fun fact, a lot of house slaves were maybe forced to sleep under porches with no clothes. They got to eat remains of stuff that people spit out of their mouth. They could get beat to death at a moment's notice. This is the elaborate house slave, right? So this is what she says on her platform that she built with the help of black and African people. And it kind of, it feels vindicating in a way, because I've been saying this. These people are agents of division. These people, and I'm not saying knowingly, I think really they just want to make money, but they look at the enmity between black men and women as something to exploit, and something that can be lucrative, and something that they can perpetuate. She gets on her platform and she says this. She does not apologize. She references Thomas Sowell, who wrote a few books on slavery, and he's somewhat of a brilliant historian, but a lot of people have disagreed with some of his work, some of his conclusions that he's come to, and sometimes he can kind of seem like an apologist. So a lot of people have spoken out against Thomas Sowell. But the fact that she could get on with no sort of shame, no trepidation, and just say that and invite a white supremacist onto her platform that she's built with the help of black African people, this shows you really, one, a lot of people look at the black community as liquid money. They can come and they can exploit us. we have this agape love for people, and in turn, we can get the knife in the back. And what's even more sickening is that there were a lot of people that work for her on her platform, the African people, some of the black folks that work on her platform, and they came forward to defend her for having a white supremacist on her platform. This just shows you the frame of mind, the lack of pride. Whereas when you look at Jewish people and people that are descendants of Holocaust victims, they never let anybody say anything outrageous about the Holocaust, which they shouldn't. It was a horrible, heinous crime of humanity. But for some reason, it's always cool to pick on slavery. It's for some reason, when we're looking at the genocides that's befallen human beings across the world, the domestic slave trade or slavery is the one thing that anybody can spit on, anybody can disrespect, and it's okay. And not only can people disrespect it, but black people will come and cape and speak up for the people that disrespected slavery. And so it makes you think, how do we get taken seriously as a community if one of the most horrific things that ever happened to our community, any and everybody can come and make light of, any and everybody can come and make fun of? Even these horrible relationship podcasts such as Pearly Things. The other thing is with Melanie King, she was actually on the clip that I was viewing in my research. She was on the clip and she was saying about how black women are least likely to get married, how black women don't know how to submit, black women are the most likely to have children out of wedlock. It's just all these different ideas and concepts she came up with when being critical of black women, when castigating black women. And what I found ironic, and when I saw this, I said, wow, you're doing all of this on a platform for somebody that invited a white supremacist on their platform. Wouldn't that conversation would have been better had if you were able to get a group of young black women around and counsel them? Wouldn't that conversation have been more appropriate maybe in a room that was like an all-black audience? I think it would have been. But a lot of these content creators, these relationship coaches, these podcasters, these YouTubers, what they're doing, me as a person, I'm a person that studied African-American history, African history, some West African history as well. And coming from that background, I have to speak out against this because and I'm coming for the misanders too. They're going to get theirs. But these misogynistic podcasts, what they're doing is that they're profiting off of a subtle vitriol that we have for one another. And it's promoting division without no resolution. And that's the key thing here. When I look and listen to all of these different platforms, the question becomes, what is the resolution? What are we going to work towards? And you don't ever hear that. And so when I look at these podcasters, whether it's Fresh and Fit saying how they don't date black women, yet they have, I think, about 1 million subscribers. When I look at Just Pearly Things, and you had a white supremacist like Nick Fuentes on. When I look at Melanie King, you got on a platform with a woman who invited a white supremacist on, and you use a segment to bash and tear down black women. I have to look at the fact that the most popular platforms with the most followers, the most subscribers, that are making the most money, so much of their rhetoric is anchored in tearing down and accosting black women from a place of racism, from a place of stereotypes that we get out of racism with no resolution. This has been episode 88. I'll be back with episode 89. Once again, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. And this has been episode 88 of the No Truths Barred podcast. Much love. Take care. Until next time.